hold on. There you go. And we'll just change the view here to the speaker. So hopefully we're going to be seeing Richard in a minute. Richard is someone who's not only local, which is a very good bonus in this case. He lives in Great Coxwell, but he's also been passionately involved in climate issues, both professionally and personally. Richard, I'm going to let you say anything else that you think is relevant in terms of your CV, although, as you saw, I did give you a very brief synopsis. So, Richard, the floor is yours. Oh, by the way, I should say, it's funny, really, that we're all thinking, the horrors that we're seeing on the news constantly, what's happening in Palestine. It's almost surreal to be talking about a different issue. But on the other hand, at the moment, it's obviously COP28 and we're in the middle of it. And clearly we all know how important an issue that is as well. So that said, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Stuart. And by way of introduction, my sort of professional life is dedicated to nature policy rather than climate specifically, but we are always absolutely keen to emphasize that nature and climate go hand in hand, and there's absolutely no way of solving the decline of biodiversity without solving the climate crisis. And in exactly the same fashion, there's absolutely no way of solving the climate crisis without sorting out biodiversity. So although I spend my days thinking about nature, climate change is high on the agenda too. And it's a thorough joy to be with the Peace Group and to see some familiar faces. So thank you so much for the invitation this evening. And I guess it's because I'm amongst friends and familiar folk that I thought I could start off with the wonderfully cheerful topic of large-scale mass corporate environmental crime to get us going as we think about the topic this evening. And there are some, absolutely outstanding examples of corporate environmental criminality that have become part of public knowledge, haven't they? There are some that we all know and remember. So I'm thinking about things like the vast dumping of chemicals by companies like DuPont that became immortalized in the Mark Ruffalo Dark Waters movie. Closer to home, I'm thinking of things like the illegal dumping of sewage at sea by particularly Southern Water was the company that's so far been convicted of mindful illegal dumping of sewage in order to avoid fines and get away with dumping sewage into our waters on a massive scale over many years. And a third example that will be familiar to all, I'm sure, is the issue of the defeat devices that you might remember that Volkswagen put in their cars over the course of almost a decade. If you remember, the defeat devices were bits of kit that helped Volkswagen pass tests on emissions from its vehicles so that it appeared that they weren't emitting as much particulate as they really were before they went into the real world and actually spewed out these particulate emissions that will have contributed to many premature deaths, including many of the 40,000 premature deaths from air pollution that we suffer here in the UK every year. And why have I started with such a cheery and also tangential topic from the climate issue? Well, I suppose it's to illustrate that dealing with pollution, dealing with the issue that over many decades, even centuries, we've treated the environment as if it's a sort of limitless dumping ground for our waste. And as if it was an endlessly renewing resource that we could continue to abuse. The ways that we deal with that rely on the law, first and foremost. So luckily, in each of those cases, was having a strong legal backstop that enabled us to take action and stop those criminal activities from taking place. Secondly, obviously, it so often comes down to money. And, alongside the law, the question of profit is one that constantly guides corporate and individual behavior when it comes to thinking about polluting activities. And for many of those companies, I'm sure where it was a conscious criminality, the question of how much it costs to pay the fine versus how much profit you might glean from going ahead with the criminal activity became part of the calculation. And we all see it, don't we, when you experience things like developers taking a slap on the wrist fine for grubbing up a hedgerow that they may not be allowed to touch, because at the moment, still too often, it pays to go ahead with the polluting or damaging activity. And it's rebalancing that calculus that eventually changes polluting activities to clean activities. And the third common feature of each of those stories of corporate criminality was the role of folk, citizen science, whistleblowers in spotting where things were happening. Think of the sewage scandal. It was down to a couple of plucky professors from our mighty universities going through the water data that was published by the Environment Agency to spot that there was a problem, and years of hammering at it to demonstrate the scale of the sewage pollution crisis. And the same was true of the emissions scandal, and the same was true of the chemical scandal. So often it relies on transparency of data and plucky communities and individuals to actually reveal those issues. But there was the reason I started with that was because actually I learned another fact about the Dieselgate scandal this morning that made me reflect on net zero. And that extra fact was that amidst the scandal of the defeat devices, while this terrible case of corporate deceit that will have contributed to shortened, worsened, darkened lives was going through the courts, Volkswagen's sales of cars actually increased. I guess it's hard for us to pin down why that happened. Part of it will have been because it was free publicity for Volkswagen. And let's face it, folks, half the time we go with what's familiar and sales follow publicity. And maybe it was because for a few people, the fact that the VW cars may actually have done better miles to the gallon may have been more important to them than the question of the emissions. That actually, some people simply didn't care. And they get the idea that actually this is going to be a pretty good car. It's going to get me further. And I guess the reflection from that weird, perverse outcome from the discovery of major corporate crime versus the individual behavior that followed is that when you get down to individual decisions about pollution and individual choices that will affect nature and climate, so often we're guided by self-interest, short-term, easy decision-making, rather than the long-term picture of what's best for the planet. Yes, we're blessed in Faringdon to have Katie's Refill Shop. Yes, it's fantastic to have groups like Hugo's that are out there campaigning for climate. But how often do we take time at the shop shelves to choose the product that's genuinely going to have the lowest emissions? How often when we buy clothes off the shelf do we think about the embedded carbon or the embedded water in the product? It's a hard thing for us to do as individuals. And the reason I wanted to emphasize that is because where we're getting to at net zero now is the issue, is the areas where it starts affecting people's daily lives. Here in the UK, we've so far managed to pluck a lot of the low-hanging fruit on dealing with the climate crisis. And actually, we've done it pretty well in some ways. So the energy sector has been absolutely transformed over the last decade and a half from one that was entirely reliant on oil, coal, and gas with a little bit of nuclear to one where the penetration of wind and solar renewables is reaching a really impressive level in the grid. And we've managed to decarbonise at a really impressive rate. And our offshore wind sector is the second largest in the world. The energy sector's share of emissions has gone down from the lion's share just over a decade ago to just about a fifth of UK emissions now. The challenge for us ahead is that the areas where we need to start looking to continue decarbonising as an economy are those where, instead of being able to change big corporate decisions like investment from BP and Shell, whether it goes to renewables or fossil fuels, some of the hardest decisions ahead are those that are going to affect our lives. And let's look at where those emissions need to come from. The agriculture and land use sector is now responsible for a quarter of the UK's emissions. Agriculture alone is responsible for 11% of our emissions. And to change that will take a massive, massive effort. That emissions from that sector have been almost flatlining for the last decade and a half. Agriculture has done scarcely anything to reduce its emissions profile for many, many years. And I guess the reason is because we're locked in a system where we're highly reliant on carbon-intensive inputs to keep growing our crops. So think of the nutrients and fertilizers that we pour in our fields. We have a large amount of meat in our diet. So of course, methane emissions from cattle are a large portion of that emissions profile. And then on the wider land use sector, it's things like the burning of peat that continues in our uplands. Our peatlands have more carbon stored in them than the rainforest, metre by metre, and yet we continue to exploit and degrade and damage that massive, globally important store of carbon. And the sort of homework question that Stuart set of is 2050 pie in the sky, is net zero by 2050 pie in the sky, absolutely relies on changing things in that sector. Because when you think about it, there's absolutely no way of doing the net bit at the moment that doesn't rely on us moving emissions from our land use from being positive and contributing to climate change to actually being negative and starting to draw down carbon, because we have no technological solution that's yet viable at scale for achieving the net in net zero. There will still be emissions from aviation, from heavy industry, and from some fossil fuel use probably by 2050. And for us ever to reach net zero, we need some way of compensating for those emissions. Some of it will come from storing emissions underground, but the most reliable method is to rely on nature-based solutions. So planting trees, restoring wetlands, enhancing habitats to lock away and sequester some of that carbon. So that's a bit of the economy that will require real-world changes for you and me and for the people we know. We'll have to have dietary shift. We'll have to see our farmers completely change their production methods to get anywhere near the hope of creating negative emissions from that sector. Where else do we look? Well, it's going to be to home heating and the way that we power our homes and heat our buildings. And there we're still massively reliant on the gas grid. We still live in a highly inefficient building stock, and we still continue to build homes that aren't net zero, that themselves don't incorporate renewables and aren't energy efficient. And the sort of scale of effort, the scale of fuss needed in our day-to-day lives of shifting from gas grid to heat pumps, of re-insulating our homes and doing all those pesky things like wall insulation, is a level of sort of interruption in our private lives that's going to take a huge amount of effort. And to do those things, I guess the main message is government needs to make it easy. Because at the moment, too often the polluting choice is the easy choice. When we look on those shelves for the products that we reach for, the cheapest choice is often the most carbon intensive choice, is often the choice that relies on deforested land somewhere far across the world to grow the soy that will have fed the animals that goes to produce our cheap meat or what have you. And it's systemic change in every sector of the economy that's going to be needed to change the situation where the cheap choice, where the easy choice becomes the environmental choice rather than the carbon intensive choice. So how's the government doing on those things here in the UK? Well, let's not be too mean. In some ways, it's doing well. I mean, it is fantastic that we have managed to deploy such a large amount of renewables over the last decade and a half. Progress has slowed recently, and we need to see serious planning reform from the government to make sure that we can deploy renewables at the scale and pace that are needed. And there have been impressive interventions with things like the early feed-in tariffs and contracts for difference that made it profitable for businesses to shift to low carbon choices, and that saw a really rapid deployment of some of those early renewables technologies. The but is, of course, coming. The but for our prospects of emissions reduction here in the UK is that although we're expected to meet the next carbon budget, which is the sort of 5-yearly envelope of emissions that we think we're allowed to get to our emissions targets, that's largely by luck. The COVID crisis saw a large change in transport choices, saw a large tail off in transport emissions. That's going to help us get to the next ones. But the Committee on Climate Change thinks the next 2 carbon budgets are at risk of being missed. And we've taken a huge step backwards recently. The government's about to introduce the Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill, which will require annual licensing rounds for exploration and development of offshore oil and gas. That's a devastatingly silly plan in a world where the International Energy Agency says that new fossil fuel resources are not compatible with net zero. It's also a devastatingly silly plan in a world in which we're supposed to be protecting 30% of the ocean for nature, yet willing to allow that licensing of drilling to go ahead in those marine protected areas. The government has also rode back on some of those policies that would help us to change the way that we heat our homes with its changes on the deadline for moving away from gas grid to other options like heat pumps. It's also rode back on its choice about the year in which we need to move from petrol vehicles, diesel and petrol vehicles, to electric vehicles, back from 2030 to 2035. So we've seen a rapid rollback over the last few months that unfortunately is a symptom of the times where I fear there's the sense that the votes might be in the common sense arena of taking our time and saving people money. And a lot of that, unfortunately, has been driven by the real world politics of energy price inflation following the war in Ukraine and food security issues that come from that sort of geopolitical change over the last couple of years. So what do we need to do? Well, first and foremost, we need to make sure that these negotiations that Stuart mentioned go with a bang. So lots of people are very, very cynical about the international talks that we're in, and rightly so at the moment. It's extraordinary that we're in an international negotiation with the head of a national oil company as the president of the international climate talks. And yet, those talks are the world's major mechanism for agreeing a year-on-year ratchet in effort towards net zero. And we've just come in these talks to the end of what's called the first global stocktake, a test of whether global efforts are adding up to the scale of effort that we need in order to curb global warming at safe levels. And the spoilers were there before the conference. The results have already been published, and they show that globally we're on course right now for 2.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And even if every pledge that the world nations have brought to the table so far were fulfilled, we'd still be in a world of 2.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And those are catastrophic. They're not just inconvenient. These are the sorts of levels of change that could lead to mass migration, loss of life, droughts, fire, famine, all the things that will make the world in which the prospect of a peace group's objectives being met feel vanishingly distant. So we absolutely have to rely on processes like COP28 to help ratchet up those global efforts to do better, and making sure that that the UK is at the forefront of those efforts really does work. You often hear people say, "Why should we bother here in the UK when China's off creating another coal plant every week, or Brazil is continuing to deforest the Amazon?" Well, it works because the sort of precedent we can set here is one that is often mimicked around the world. So the Climate Change Act, that piece of legislation that set the world's first legally binding targets for carbon emissions reduction, were mimicked around the world. Similarly, our transition to nature-friendly farming is something that has the potential to be a model for a just transition, a fair way to help people move away from carbon-intensive farming towards a better model. And so, I guess by way of answer to Stuart's big question, I have absolutely no idea whether we will get to net zero by 2050. The runes do not read well for the current trajectory we're on. But the real challenge and the important challenge is to get to 2030, because lots of the emissions that profile that takes place over the next 10 years will be what determines the scale of warming anyway. And it's that course that we lock in over the next 10 years that will matter when it comes to our ability to limit warming beneath the critical 1.5 degrees. So as we approach the election here in the UK, we'll be trying to encourage the government to regain that leadership position that it's sort of sacrificed over the last couple of months, to see that initiatives like President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, with billions of dollars of investment going into the low carbon economy, or the Green Prosperity Plan that's going forward in the EU, are absolutely the way to achieve large-scale growth at the same time as decarbonisation. And the way we need to channel those things is not just towards big industry and the energy sector, but more broadly towards that those sections where we'll start to see change in your lifestyle and my lifestyle. So to land use change choices, to home heating and insulation, and to the sorts of calculations that we all make on the shop shelves every day. I'm smiling at the end because those, those awful examples that I started with, where you see people's individual motivations being driven by profits and by short-term considerations, are in some ways completely at odds with the hope that processes like COP can give us all, because it is worth remembering that as a species, for the first time in human history, we're considering a intervention that could reshape every portion of every economy in every country in the world. And I think that's a massive and amazing thing to do. And the fact that a fossil fuel phase out is still on the cards as one of the outcomes of the conference in the days ahead is something that could be one of the most defining moments in human history, if it's one that can be agreed. So I have no answer to the net zero by 2050 question. I hope we'll get there, but the thing that we must focus on is decarbonisation by 2030. And here in the UK, it's regaining that leadership position on advancing renewables at pace and reaching out beyond those easy to reach sectors into the bits that impinge on your life and mine. And I'll leave it there so that we can go into a little bit of discussion. I hope that's useful by way of background.
Hang on, sorry, I was on mute. Well, thanks so much, Richard, for what I would suggest was actually being a presentation trying to be fair to the various parties. I think you've been trying to be quite generous to some of the good things that, and I mean, this rowing back thing that we've seen over the last few months, and you put it down to just politicking and trying to gain votes for whatever reason, thinking that perhaps, you know, the great unwashed are going to be fooled by this nonsense. But it is surely a huge opportunity for the other parties to actually call them out for this nonsense. Because when Rishi Sunak says, and it will be the poorest that get hurt by green policies, then we all know that that's a completely upside down statement. You know, and someone like Caroline Lucas would be shouting from the rooftops and saying, what a load of baloney that is. It's the exact opposite. So in a way, it is an opportunity for the other parties to actually get out there and tell people what is really happening. You know, fossil fuel now are more expensive than the green technologies. So anyway, sorry, go ahead, comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think the politics is a big portion of it. It's appealing to an ideology that suggests all of this sort of woke climatism is a left-wing conspiracy almost. That the government would never go that far, but there's a sort of dog whistle in that direction, isn't there? When you refer to common sense, everybody knows what common sense means. It means not doing that silly lefty stuff. And I think that there's certainly a stepping into that space. And the tragedy of it is that we've had cross-party consensus on the need for more urgent climate action for over a decade now, for 15 years, and this really puts that into question. And you're absolutely right. It ultimately will be cheaper for society to shift away from carbon-intensive fuels. Our lives will be healthier, and we'll save a huge amount of money for things like the NHS. There is, though, and there has to be, a short-term trade-off. I don't think that we can pretend that rapid decarbonisation won't, in the short term, increase prices. It will, and it might also affect the products and the lifestyle choices that we have on offer. Because although renewables are ultimately cheaper, they do require a large upfront investment, which needs to be paid for. And although we can see ways, for example, to move from the current energy-hungry steel production that we have to clean steel, that's going to need a large-scale capital investment in the short term. The question is, how much are we willing to invest now in order to look after people's interest in the long term and indeed for future generations? And in the short term, where there are going to be cost implications, how do we make sure that that's done in a fair way, where you're building in support for the people most likely to be affected? So I don't think we can pretend that there's going to be that choosing a low carbon change now would be instantly cheaper. In most cases, it wouldn't. But we do need to make sure that, that we show that the long-term economic case is in that direction, and that we build in the social support mechanisms that would help people to get over that hump in the road that will take us to the cleaner economy of the future.
Phil, you've got your hand up. The floor is open, by the way, so just either raise your hand physically or use the little hand raising icon at the bottom. But Phil, you were first, and then Peter.
Thank you, Richard. An interesting talk. But as you're addressing the peace group, I'm surprised you've never mentioned, as far as I didn't hear any mention of the carbon emissions from the military. Why is that?
Good,
you.
good question, Phil. Partly because I've no idea what they are, and like many sectors of public interest, the military manages to get itself a carve out from all sorts of things.
I know.
The military, for example, has carve out from the polluter pays principle, which just entered in UK law, came into force in UK law a couple of weeks ago. There's a carve out for the MOD and for the Treasury, ironically. But you're right, there's a huge carbon implication from the military. There's also a huge opportunity for the Ministry of Defence, which is one of our largest landowners, to contribute to net zero by improving its land holdings to sequester carbon. And most importantly of all, I guess it's worth saying that obviously armed conflict is a has terrible implications for any sort of environmental choices in the round, because the more dependent people are, the more poverty there is, the more the basic governance of state falls apart, the less hope we have for any sort of transition. So I didn't mention it because it's not one that I know the details of well, but you're absolutely right that there shouldn't be carve-outs for that kind of operation.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Richard. Very interesting talk. I just wanted to raise this rather horrifying outcome from COP28 that 20 countries have pledged to triple their nuclear power by 2050, which seems to be an extraordinary outcome, and particularly ironic in the light of the Guardian's revelations over the last couple of days about the appalling state of Sellafield and its leaking of radioactive material into the groundwater in that area, and the staggering cost of decommissioning nuclear power stations, which is often swept aside. It seems so strange that with all that background and the very clear link between nuclear power's rationale and nuclear weapons production, that a climate conference could deduce that this was really a way forward. I wondered what your thoughts were.
Well, I mean, for all the hope that international collaboration on climate gives me, that the world's record on nuclear armaments fills me with horror. When you see those visualizations of the explosions that sort of pervade the map where we've done tests, and the inability of the non-proliferation treaty to actually lead to any sort of serious disarmament is harrowing. I mean, I wouldn't, I don't know that nuclear power choices necessarily have sort of a direct line to the weaponization now that horror is out of the bottle. Although the prospect of things like dirty bombs and things as well as accidents is, I suppose, one that we choose at our peril. But you said it yourself. Especially here in the UK, the costs of nuclear quite quickly make it look like a difficult part of the energy mix. Let's say we've never had a nuclear power plant in this country that has managed to prove itself economic, and a huge amount of DEFRA's budget is still devoted to managing the waste and the decommissioning of our legacy power plants. So what makes us think we're likely to have a much better record in future? I don't know, and that's quite apart from the natural environment implications of places like Hinkley C, which people like the RSPB are up in arms about, because it's a fool's game to trade off one element of the natural environment versus another. So would I say that I'd rather have a world without nuclear? That would be wonderful. Can every country manage to decarbonize without nuclear? I don't know. Can we in the UK? I think so. The faster that we realise that there are large implicit subsidies in looking after nuclear and start to shift that cash to employing a better, more intelligent grid and interconnection, the better in my book.
Thank you. Are there any hands raised? Jenny. Karen.
I'd like to go back to the question of that Phil raised on the carbon emissions of the military. I think I'm right in saying that those emissions are not generally known because they're not included on the, is it the United Nations that draws up all these statistics? And I don't think there's any mention of inclusion of, as I say, of the military figures. But there is an organization which perhaps you've heard of, Richard, the Scientists for Global Responsibility. And they have drawn up a very comprehensive sort of set of figures and estimates based on what can be known. And they are very definite that, of course, that the carbon emissions of the military are something that which we really should be taking into consideration. And I'm not a scientist in any way, but it occurs to me that if there's a whole set of figures that are not being used when they're drawing up the figures for targets and whatever else, that the situation we're in is infinitely worse than even the scientists at the moment are saying. So it's not good, and it's really about time that we sorted out these extra figures that we really do need to know and do something about.
There have been major sources and sinks of emissions that we are only just getting a handle on. I mean, it's only a couple of years ago that the land use emissions from peat were included in our national inventory of emissions. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a major source of emissions from land use degradation, and one that ought to be going in the opposite direction. In the same way, blue carbon, so carbon embedded in the seafloor, that at the moment is being churned up and released every time those industrial dredgers scarify our seabed. That's releasing carbon that's been stored there for millennia. And, you know, it absolutely goes to show that we've still got a huge amount to learn to make sure that we're properly accounting for emissions across the board, and that while those information gaps are there, we can't be complacent. Just because we don't know exactly how much is stored in the sea doesn't mean that we shouldn't take action to protect those areas of soils or seabed that we know are vast stores of carbon. As for the military, I mean, it would be good to know what those emissions are. I honestly don't know who does know. It might be that it's on public record. There are greening government commitments that apply across all departments that we ought to be able to see action on. Is it likely to be one of our most important sectors for emissions? Probably not. And actually, if you're thinking about things like aviation and transport, it's much more the sort of consumer side. It's likely to be the big areas for reduction rather than the military. I mean, you can just, as far as I'm concerned, add it to a list of reasons to change military practice and global attitudes to armaments and defence, and there are probably far more compelling arguments for moving away from the scale of national spending that we put on defence than the carbon one. But it's it's definitely one to consider, and the carve out seems silly.
Karen.
Yeah, we watched a very good programme the other day. I don't know what it was called, with Hugh Fernley, Whittingstall, Mary Portas and Kevin MacLeod, to do with carbon reduction and climate change. And there was a town in Sweden which had already gone carbon neutral. And this was a large, thriving town with industry, with, you know, lots of people, can't remember how big. And the mayor was, you know, he'd been elected for decades because everyone loved him, because, you know, he'd pushed through all these green initiatives. And I'm sure the Swedish government is more supportive than ours anyway. But, you know, this town had managed to do so much and with such a positive attitude. And everybody loved it because their bills were reduced, the air was cleaner, transport was easier. And I just wish there was some way we could grab hold of that here and get that enthusiasm for green initiatives, rather than thinking, oh, I don't know, well, you know, I do like my gas cooker, and you know, that sort of thing. I just want it to be a positive message, you know, and it would obviously need government subsidies, but it was such a heartwarming programme. And then you sort of come back to reality, and then you hear the government reneging on yet another promise, you know, putting it off. And it just sort of puts it in stark contrast that we're going in so much the wrong direction. And yet we could all feel good about this. You know, we need to feel good about something. And the main thing is house building regulations. I cannot understand that they are still building with gas boilers and without proper insulation. It's just ridiculous. And, you know, if the cost of, you know, having renewable energy and insulation in new houses was shared between the government, the developer, maybe, you know, a little bit extra for those who could afford it, who are buying them, then why don't we do it? It's sorry, I'm not asking a question. I'm just so frustrated, but I was so inspired by this town that I want to go there. In fact,
Yes.
I'd like to live there, but you know, that's not going to happen. But it's just this positive message that we're so much lacking in this country, I think.
It is, and sadly, so often those case studies are limited to those areas where people have the affluence and the leisure to do it themselves. And the question for us has to be, how do you make that standard? Some people will do it for the feel good, but basically you have to reshape decision making so that it becomes the normal, don't you? Building regulations, that one is just so obvious. And when the zero carbon home standard was cancelled, I think many of us raised our hands in despair, because the building industry, let's face it, is highly profitable, and the fact that it's able to cry viability, so to make the case that houses wouldn't be built if they were to add the cost of renewables and insulation, which is a few £1,000s per dwelling, on top of their existing costs. It's extraordinary that we gave in to that scale of corporate lobbying. And retrofitting is harder. It will need a large amount of public sector investment to help people to change our very old housing stock in this country to something that's efficient, and that will mean costs now. And the only way to make that happen is to stump up public money to make it an easy choice for people, and to regulate so that it becomes essential. Because, you know, we're all busy. We're all feeling like we need extra ready cash. To get it beyond the margins, it has to be there in regulation, and it has to be with public money behind it to make it work, or else big polluter pays regulations to make someone else pay for it, as we have with the energy companies.
Anyone else? We don't want to hog the floor here. Yeah, go ahead, Hugo.
It's really, I'm just asking you for a comment. I spend a lot of time on pavements talking to people about climate, and it seems to me it's not a left-right issue in this country yet. They're trying to make it into one, but it isn't one yet. But there are, it seems to me, increasing numbers of people who are skeptical about science. They literally don't believe the science. They've got a mobile phone in their pocket, but they don't believe in science. How can we counter that? They don't believe the basic facts that you tell them are facts.
Yeah, that's tricky, isn't it? And I think you're right. It's not a left-right issue, and we have benefited from a consensus on this for a long time. And there's a risk now that that gets driven apart as the government seeks to attract a certain part of its supporter base and abandons another, and that would be an act of folly, really, in terms of the climate. How do you get people to change? Well, I do think that there's a role for the public sector in education and public messaging that at the moment our government has considered to be too narrow state to get involved with. So the Committee on Climate Change has called for a long time for a public information campaign around climate to help people over that question. That there will always be folk who disagree or simply don't care, though, and that's why, for me, it's getting back to changing the system so that the choices people make or the offers that are there in front of them don't rely on individual choice for change, and that requires brave leadership from politicians rather than sort of appealing to an imagined constituency of support from going in the opposite direction.
Richard, you mentioned how easy it is for people to demonize countries like Brazil or China, just in a sense, to be able to find an excuse to just continue with their own status quo or whatever. So, in other words, not to do anything. Yeah, what's the point if? And to a certain extent, I'm slightly allergic to how China does get demonized, because in a way, yeah, they are by far, in a way, the largest manufacturer and installer of green technologies. This is unbelievably impressive. You mentioned the coal mines, which of course is one of the bad points there, but nonetheless, there they are. And the other reason that I feel that it's very unjustified to demonize China is because during the 90s and the beginning of this millennium, we did our very best, really. Well, I suspect we didn't really want to, but we managed to export an awful lot of our manufacturing base, including the carbon footprint associated with it, to China. And then we promptly blamed them for having a large carbon footprint through manufacturing, which is absolutely fascinating. And in a way, it really does highlight what is almost an elephant in the room when it comes to carbon targets and countries, because at the moment, those carbon targets are essentially based on the producer targets rather than the consumer targets. And that, of course, is entirely upside down, but it really does suit the richer countries, i.e. those with the most lobbying power, because they are the consumers, and therefore they would much prefer a system that the bad guys are the ones that are the other countries that happen to be producing the goods, and they look slightly better because they're only consuming them. So, your comments?
Oh dear, yes. I mean, consumption-based emissions sort of makes a mockery of our progress so far. We've done really well on, well, pretty well on the energy sector, but we are still utterly reliant on fossil fuels when it comes to most of our lifestyle, and that's where it gets really hard for people to envisage change. There will be progress, hopefully, with things like a carbon border tax, because the EU is doing it, so we're going to have to follow. And in that case, although we had no decision at the table, luckily the EU went in the right direction, and we realised that we can't sit as a little island, so that might help. But you're right, China's done lots of good as well. It has often been a regressive force in international climate politics, but it turned a corner a couple of years ago when it said it would set its own reduction limits, and China is now aiming to peak its own emissions by 2030. If it does that, that will be an amazing contribution to our chances of meeting the Paris deal. And the reason that we're able to afford renewables now in many cases is because of the cost reductions that have been achieved by China. So global price of solar was brought down almost single-handedly by the investments that China put into the solar economy. So yes, it's an unfair picture. There is still a huge amount more for China to do because it is such a large chunk of global emissions, but the fact that we bear a huge historical responsibility is reason enough for us to keep going. The other question, if you care about things like growth and the traditional economy, is whether we'd like to own our own assets or not. And actually, a lot of the global investment in the renewables right now is coming from countries like China, who are merrily producing all of the assets that go to build our wind farms or our solar farms. And we won't own any of our own low carbon economy unless we start investing at speed and scale. And that's why President Biden got his stuff through, because they have had the foresight, whether you care about the climate or not, to see that the green economy is a massive prize, and to realize that at the moment, here in the UK, we're about to rent out our entire critical national infrastructure to investors from third countries for production and ownership of those assets. So there's a really old-fashioned economic argument for change as well that China has seen and is racing ahead for that prize too.
Okay, Helen.
Yeah, I was wondering how we ensure that the global south are able to develop without being targeted, as we've heard from COP28, that that the oil producing nations are targeting the global south to tie them into a fossil fuel infrastructure in the future. How can we ensure that that these countries get access to renewable technology at a cheaper price than than the fossil fuel companies are, presumably discounting their infrastructure?
Yeah, this is, the climate is fundamentally an equity issue, isn't it? Both between generations, so future generations' ability to look after themselves as we have, and between the global north and the global south. And there's no doubt that the rich countries are responsible for the harm, and that if we want any hope of avoiding the damage, we've got to help those countries to leapfrog the dirty stage of development that we went through. And the three sort of major agendas for this COP are mitigation and adaptation funding and that finance agenda. So we're doing really badly on mobilizing the sorts of contributions for finance to help poorer countries to adapt and decarbonize. Was it back in 2015 that we pledged to 100 billion funds? We've seen nowhere near that amount of finance flowing from rich to poorer countries, and hopefully that's one of the things that we might see a bit of progress on yet in the next 6 or 7 days, to see those pledges renewed and made real, because part of it will be down to opening intellectual property and things, but most of it will come down to finance and helping those countries to take a greener path.
And to put it in context, the 100 billion target was immediately criticised by the developing countries. They said we need at least 1 trillion. So we're not even hitting 100 billion, but it's not even touching the edges as to what really is needed. So, John, unmute.
Yes, sorry. I wonder if I could take you back a little bit. You said earlier about the big oil companies making big strides towards green structures and efforts. What do you feel about the structure of UK agriculture and its ability to make these changes that you obviously feel, I mean, I can share that, are required, bearing in mind sort of agriculture and its market in the country?
If I was nice to the oil companies, then that was definitely a slip of the tongue, and I immediately retract those comments. Obviously, there is some renewables investment coming from the big energy giants, but nowhere near enough. And the commitments that we've seen over the last few days for net zero from however many oil companies it was by whatever date is a load of greenwash. They're talking only about their production emissions rather than from the use of the products that they're digging up. And they're also talking obviously about using a lot of offsets, which could probably be worth very little. So those companies, you know, they're not all the same, but they still have a huge amount to do to get anywhere near a green plaudit. So I retract those comments. As for agriculture, I mean, I ought to have made more play about the nature side of the equation, since that's the bit I know about. A third of the effort to get us to net zero has to come from changing land use and agriculture. There, you know, as I mentioned before, there's simply no way to do net zero unless you turn us around from being a world of emitting from the way we use our land to a world where we're storing away vast amounts of carbon. And what we need from the agriculture sector is twofold. We need a serious plan to reduce the direct emissions that they're responsible for, which comes primarily from livestock, deforestation, and the use of synthetic chemicals in farming production. And to be honest, I would probably tax those things if I had the choice, and make it much harder to go about those carbon intensive choices, particularly with things like fertilizers. I would regulate away the most intensive choices. We have massive intensive farming around the world, but also a growing amount here in the UK, where the density that we stock cattle, the massive chicken sheds that you'll have seen along the Wye, you know, we are allowing large-scale industrial farming to proceed, and I would change the permitting thresholds and make it clear that the worst kinds of intensive farming are off the table. But then on the positive side, just briefly, farmers have to be part of the solution for all this. And the best farmers are already working to restore the carbon that's embedded in their soil. They're already working to reincorporate trees in their field systems with things like agroforestry. They're already allowing their hedgerows to regenerate and broaden and thicken. They're already moving away from those chemicals choices. And personally, I think that the way that we reward farmers should be much, much braver. I'll promise to stop wittering on in a second, but at the moment we pay farmers on the basis of what we call costs plus income foregone. So even the greenest, bravest farmers only get paid for the amount of money that they spend and the amount of income they've lost from not doing traditional farming. That's nowhere near enough. We should be spending large amounts of money rewarding farmers, paying them for environmental benefits, so that you create some winners. And those green champions in the farming sector who are actually doing things well, like organic farmers, like no-till, low input farmers, those guys should be massively rewarded in the years ahead to signal a big shift in that sector, so that instead of being an emissions producing sector, it actually becomes the emissions reduction sector that we need to hit net zero. We spend between 14 and 20 billion pounds on roads every year in this country. We only spend 2 or 3 billion pounds on farmers who look after 70% of our land. Daft.
Thank you.
Thank you. By the way, there are interesting comments. If you look at the chat part of the screen, you may be able to see it, or you may have to open it especially to be able to see it. But Peter has added a comment, and Zareen has made a very interesting comment about Swaffham. Sorry, Karen, did you put your hand up? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to mention Swaffham Prior in Cambridgeshire that Zareen has posted about, which has gone completely renewable. And I wondered, Richard, how much difference you think it could make with small communities like that doing their own thing. And I know in Great Coxwell you've had a green power initiative, or maybe it goes wider than that. And I wondered, you know, how much enthusiasm you found in the village, or how much, you know, antagonism it's created, you know, just what it's like trying to do something locally, and whether local initiatives will end up making a big difference nationally.
The bottom-up stuff always helps, and pioneer projects give you a sense of what's possible. They won't solve it though. We need the systemic change to change what's normal. And sadly, in Great Coxwell, we're not going ahead anymore. What we were looking at was community ground source heat to help us to shift away from reliance on old-fashioned heating. Half the village signed up as interested, which was great. Some of those people did so because at that time we were just in the midst of the Ukraine crisis, and the energy prices were just going right up, and they thought, yes, we'll do this for costs. But just as many wanted to do it because of the excitement of being somewhere green. Unfortunately, when it came back to it, we saw that we'd have to have our own electricity supply as well as the ground source heat. So we'd need a wind farm or a solar farm to power it, and it was going to come to £30 million or something. And there are no grants available for villages of our size at the moment from the government. So sadly, it just wasn't viable for the village anymore. Some of the pioneer towns have benefited from previous grants, and it really is hugely wonderful to see how enthusiastic some of those places were to talk to us about it and share their learning. But until there's support there to make it an option, I fear it will remain something that exists on the fringes. And Westmill, well, you know, Westmill is another example, isn't it? Where the subsidies were there, the enthusiasm that greeted the two Westmills was amazing. But it was because the feed-in tariffs were there to make it pay, and half the people did it because they wanted to be green, half the people did it because they wanted investments for their children or whatever. So sadly, back to this sort of human nature point at the start, you've got to make it pay as well as do the right thing.
A good news story. Some of you might have watched the Planet Earth 3, the last one, and this a little bit about the humpback whales. It was from Planet Earth 3, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So wasn't that absolutely amazing that they thought that the re-emergence of humpback whale population would mean less fish because the humpback whales would eat all the fish. And they didn't realize that there were also going to be incredible carbon footprint benefits. But in fact, there's more fish because the poo from the humpback whales is very rich in iron, which creates masses of plankton, which the fish all eat. So now the fish population has gone up. And the most amazing bit of information in that was that a single humpback whale, in terms of the carbon footprint reduction, or basically the absorption of carbon, is the equivalent of planting 20,000 trees. It's incredible, isn't it? And that came from nowhere. It wasn't planned. You know, it was just an unintended benefit from from the increased population of humpback whales. It's fascinating, isn't it, to see nature kind of do its own thing and kind of tell us, by the way, you know, I'm kind of more clever than you are sometimes. So, you know, let it do its own thing. It's a little bit like rewilding of the sea, isn't it? And anyway, sorry.
If I looked distressed for a second there, Stuart, it's because there are actually people out there who are trying to sell carbon offsets for whales that are not dead.
Ah, brilliant.
On the basis of them being worth 10,000 trees. As always, the question with offsets is, have you made a difference?
Yeah.
And I can't see a world in which that's going to be a genuine carbon emissions reduction. But I must run for a train in a second. So your message of the power of nature is maybe a good one to finish on, and those unexpected benefits of creating ecosystems that function with a whole web of life at massive scale. That's what we've got to aim for if we're going to have any hope of creating a nation that's resilient to flood and fire. If we're going to have any hope of creating a natural environment that can sequester and store that carbon, it's making sure that we're not just picking off an individual's stand of trees to sell it for good marketing. It's that actually we're thinking about the glory of an ecosystem that can supports those great megafauna like whales, as well as the tiny mad things like the sand eels. That is going to be our chances of a green, climate resilient future.
And on that point, well, Richard, thanks ever so much. It's been very, very interesting and very informative too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Right, I hope you get your train.
Thank you. The 9:30 one has been cancelled, so I'm going to run for the 9:22 to Faringdon. So
yeah, bye.
See you back in Faringdon.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, okay. See you tomorrow night.
See you tomorrow night.
Oh, by the way, Richard.
No, let him go. Let him go.
Claire has just look at your WhatsApp messages.
Will do. Will do.
Yeah. Okay, bye. All right. All right, we'll close the meeting, everyone, but there will be the recording that's available. So
14.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
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 I wanted to know how to get to the chat session.
I think it's share content.
If you look along the bottom, Jenny,
Yes.
one of the options is chat.
No, it's not, you see.
There it is.
You've got it somewhere else, have you?
No, yes. Now I've got it. Now I've got it.
Well done. Okay.
The chat-
So now you just have to remember how you got it, because each person's screen is very slightly different,
Yes, I can understand.
depending on what computer they're
Yeah.
using. Yeah. Can you see it?
Oh,
Yeah.
there it is.
I've got it.
Oh,
It's gone.
Oh, right.
somebody's taken away. It's you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.